This is the world before trees. The Earth we know today is dominated by forests. Over 5 billion years of life, plants have colonized almost every part of our planet, creating an interconnected web of woody tissues that has sequestered massive amounts of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. But it hasn't always been this way. For the first 2 billion years after life arose, Earth was a treeless rock. Then about 365 million years ago, the first forest began to grow, and they changed our planet forever. And since then, trees have survived mass extinctions, dramatic climate change, and countless other disturbances to become the dominant land plants on Earth. But what came before all that? What did the Earth look like before trees took over? To find out, we can turn to the fossil record. The oldest known forest is located in the northeastern corner of what's now Scotland. This ancient woods, which grew around 397 million years ago, was made up of a group of plants called Archaeopterids. These were some of the earliest vascular plants, or those with specialized tissues for transporting water and nutrients. And they show us that even early forests had a lot of diversity. They weren't all tall, thin trees, like the redwoods and pines we think of today. Some were short and shrubby, while others were tall and slender. There were even some plants that had grown so wide they may have acted as living bridges across small gaps in the landscape. But despite their size and shape, all of these plants were related. They all shared a common ancestor that lived around 420 million years ago. And it was during the next 20 million years that this group diversified into the many forms we see in the fossil record. But despite how diverse this forest was, it didn't take over the entire landscape. Other types of plants still thrived too, including several groups of non-vascular plants like mosses and liverworts. The reason is that there wasn't really such a thing as a forest ecosystem back then. See, we tend to think of forests as being made up only of trees, but that's not really true. A forest is actually an ecosystem dominated by woody plants. That means trees aren't the only organisms that need to be present for an area to qualify as a forest. You also need shrubs, ferns, mosses, insects, birds, fungi, bacteria, and more. All of these organisms interact with each other in a complex web of relationships that allow the forest to function as a whole. And it turns out that most of these components of the forest ecosystem appeared relatively late in Earth's history. For example, the earliest animals to live on land, which were arthropods like millipedes and their relatives, didn't appear until about 360 million years ago. That's only a few million years before the first forests, and this likely wasn't a coincidence. The evolution of land animals and plants may have driven each other. Plants provided animals with new habitats and food sources, while animals helped plants reproduce by dispersing their pollen and seeds. But since these interactions were so mutually beneficial, they couldn't evolve independently of each other. This is why the earliest forests weren't found until a few million years after the first arthropods arrived on land. They needed each other to make a full-fledged forest ecosystem. However, even though these early forests were the first of their kind, they wouldn't last forever. After they appeared, they went extinct, clearing the way for a whole new group of plants to rise up and dominate the landscape. But who were these plants, and where did they come from? To answer that question, we're going to have to travel back in time a little further, much further. We're going to go back 470 million years, just after the first animals had begun to colonize land, and vascular plants were just beginning to evolve. This was a time when the Earth's surface looked nothing like it does today, because there was a whole other kingdom of organisms that dominated the landscape. These are the fungus animals, or Myxomycetes, and they were neither fungus nor animals. Instead, they were a totally different kingdom of life. These organisms were eukaryotes, meaning their cells had nuclei and other membrane-bound structures. But unlike plants and animals, they got their nutrition by absorbing organic matter from their surroundings. As a result, scientists debate whether to call them fungi, protists, or something else entirely. Because of their unusual status, very little is known about the fungi animals. However, we do know that they were extremely successful. They were among the first eukaryotes to live on land, and they flourished for 200 million years. By at least 400 million years ago, some species had grown to be 10 centimeters tall, if not taller. In fact, the tallest organism in one part of the fossil record is a fungus animal that reached a maximum height of 5 meters. That's taller than some of the earliest trees. So how did these organisms grow so big? Well, it probably had to do with their unique body plan. Fungus animals were made up of thread-like cells called hyphae, similar to the hyphae that make up modern fungi. And instead of relying on roots to anchor them to the ground, their hyphae formed a dense interwoven mass that made them rigid. This allowed them to stand upright and reach impressive heights. But eventually something happened that caused the reign of the fungus animals to come to an end. Their fossils disappear from the record 200 million years after they first appeared, leaving a gap of 100 million years before the first forests. And we don't know exactly what caused their extinction, but we have some clues. One possibility is that the evolving relationship between plants and animals may have played a role. Early plants and animals seem to have benefited from each other's presence, but some plants may have begun producing chemicals to defend themselves from insects. And some animals may have started hunting other animals, both of which would have led to competition. And since fungus animals were neither plants nor animals, they would have been exempt from these defenses and better able to thrive. This could explain why they disappeared right when forests began to appear. Or perhaps they were simply outcompeted by the first vascular plants. See, vascular plants, like the ancestors of modern trees and shrubs, had a major advantage over the fungus animals. They could transport water and nutrients more efficiently, so they could grow taller and live in drier habitats. As a result, they may have simply outcompeted the fungus animals for resources, leading to their extinction. Whatever the cause, the fungus animals disappeared and left the stage open for the first vascular plants to take over. These plants flourished for the next 10 million years, growing larger and more diverse until the first forests appeared. But what did this world look like? How were the first forests different from the ones we know today? First of all, the plants in these forests weren't actually trees. Instead, the dominant type of plant was the lycopod. These were small plants, only a few centimeters tall, which grew in dense mats across the landscape. The first forest was probably a dark place. The sun never reached the ground because the canopy of lycopods blocked all the light. And the plants themselves didn't help much because they lacked the colorful flowers and broad leaves that reflect and scatter light today. This lack of light may have been one of the reasons the first forests didn't have much animal life. Most animals need light to survive, so they probably stuck to the edges of the woods where plants grew close to the surface. But not all the organisms living in these forests were plants. There were also arthropods, the first animals to live on land. The oldest known arthropod, a relative of modern millipedes, was only 2 centimeters long. These creatures were perfectly adapted for life in a low-light, moist forest. Since they could absorb oxygen through their skin, they didn't need to develop lungs, and they used their many legs to crawl under rocks and leaf litter where they were moist. These adaptations allowed them to survive for millions of years, but eventually something caused their extinction, clearing the way for a whole new group of arthropods to dominate. Insects. The first insects appeared around 390 million years ago, and they quickly became the dominant land animals. Like arachnids, they were well adapted to life in the forest ecosystem. Many of them could fly, allowing them to travel quickly from plant to plant. And their mouth parts were perfect for piercing the skin of plants and sucking out their juices. This adaptation proved to be extremely successful, and insects quickly radiated into a wide variety of new forms. Today, there are more than 1 million known species of insects, and likely millions more that have not been discovered yet. Clearly, insects have been incredibly successful, but that doesn't mean they've always had it easy. Throughout their history, they've faced countless challenges, and it's often seemed as though they might go extinct. But somehow, they've managed to bounce back from every mass extinction, coming back stronger than ever. And we can learn a lot from them. By studying insects, we can understand how life has changed in response to environmental change. And the more we learn, the more we realize that the future of life on Earth may depend on our ability to adapt, just like insects have done for millions of years. And what you think about it, let me know down in the comment.